This is our next screenshot video in our first 2 weeks of the crimes course, and we're now shifting our focus to federal courts. Before I begin looking at the posting as it pertains to the federal court system, specifically as that system handles federal criminal offenses, I first want to focus on the possibility that I mentioned at the end of the last video, which is that a state criminal case can sometimes end up in the federal court system. And I have used Miranda versus Arizona as an example because all of you, or nearly all of you, have heard about Miranda by way of watching TV or movies. But what can sometimes happen is we have a state criminal case, could be in the state criminal court system of New York, or in this case, Miranda, Arizona. And so a defendant is charged with violating a state criminal law. Miranda, for example, was charged with uh, violating the Arizona criminal code and was indeed convicted of kidnapping and rape. During his state criminal proceeding, the defendant raised a constitutional issue under the U.S. Constitution because part of the evidence used against him was a confession that he gave. It's not uncommon for a defendant charged in a state criminal court for violating a state criminal law to claim that the law enforcement has violated his rights under the U.S. Constitution, and this is precisely what happened in Arizona. When a defendant has raised that claim and has lost his or her appeals in the state court system, she can ask the U.S. Supreme Court, to review the conviction solely on the basis that there's a violation of the U.S. Constitution. Death penalty cases coming up from the state courts uh, are also examples of that, where the defendant is claiming that a particular application of the state law, as it pertains to capital punishment, has violated the defendant's rights under the U.S. Constitution. In any event, what we then see is the U.S. Supreme Court, uh, which is obviously part of the federal court system, reviewing a state criminal court conviction and overturning that conviction at least some of the time, as happened in Miranda versus Arizona. So that's part of the business of federal courts and the criminal court system involving the states. I'm going to move up, though, now to look at a diagram of the federal court system. And here we're concerned about how that system processes uh, cases where a defendant has been charged with violating the federal criminal law. In other words, the U.S. Congress has passed a law making certain conduct a crime. Sometimes there's an overlap, like some of our drug offenses can be charged under state law or federal law. And usually it's based on who gets there first. Is this an investigation by the Erie County Sheriff's Department, uh, which will likely then end up in a state criminal charge, or is this an investigation being conducted by the federal drug enforcement agency, in which case we're probably going to end up with a federal criminal charge. If we have a federal criminal charge, then it's going to work its way through the federal court system. And I pay uh, more attention to the federal court system in the civil practice course, but this gives us an overview. So, if you will, our first rung on the ladder will be our United States district courts. And the U.S. and its territories are divided into 94 federal judicial districts. We here in Buffalo are in the United States District Court for the Western District of New York. And then Moving up, we have an intermediate level of appellate courts, the U.S. Courts of Appeals, and those courts are divided into 12 regional circuits. To stick with the Buffalo example, we're in the U.S. District Court for the Western District of New York, but we're also, if we move up the ladder, we're in the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Judicial Circuit. And that court, by the way, sits in New York City. So if we were to argue a case in front of that court, we've got to get ourselves into New York City. I remember once having an argument. It was in a civil case, but I was walking from my hotel over to the U.S. Court of Appeals in Lower Manhattan, and there were barriers up. There were cops on horses. This is before 9/11, by the way, and so the security seemed to be particularly tight for those days. And once I got in the courthouse, I asked a security person, what's with all of the security? And he said, well, the government is executing Timothy McVeigh today, and there was just a concern that there may be some unrest. But in any event, we have the U.S. Court of Appeals, regional circuits. We're in the Second Circuit. And then at the top of the list, of course, at the pinnacle is the United States Supreme Court, often, I guess, referred to as SCOTUS, the Supreme Court of the United States. And that, of course, sits or is headquartered in Washington, D.C., and there are 9 judges on that court. If we look at federal criminal cases, what happens is they begin in the U.S. I've just taken felony as an example. But if it's a misdemeanor, the same deal. The case starts out at the U.S. District Court level. A disposition is reached. And if there's going to be an appeal, and again, remember that if the defendant has been found not guilty, then there's no appeal ever. But if there's been an appeal, it's going to be taken up to the U.S. Court of Appeals. And if it's from Western District of New York, to the Second Circuit. And then after the Second Circuit determines the case can be appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, but it's as difficult, if not more difficult, to get the case up to the U.S. Supreme Court as it is to get a state criminal case in New York up to the New York Court of Appeals. It's effectively an appeal by permission. So that gives us an overview. And the reason we want to, from time to time, think about federal criminal cases in the federal criminal court system is that if we're working in a hypothetical law firm in Buffalo, let's say, that does criminal defense work, some of our clients will be charged not with state crimes, but with federal crimes. And we're going to find ourselves then not in one of the local courts or state Supreme Court or county court, but we'll be presenting ourselves to the U.S. District Court for the Western District in downtown Buffalo. So that's going to conclude this screenshot video.